A quote from St. Justin Martyr: "Reason directs those who are truly pious and philosophical to honor and love only what is true." What effect does our use of words and language have on our thinking and reasoning? What is the relationship between the structure of our language and thought on the one hand and that of actual reality on the other? Are there basic categories which are inherent to and objectively divide reality, or are all categories only the product of minds? These are some of the questions which should be kept in thought throughout today's episode as we dive into the text of Aristotle's Categories. My name is Harrison, and this is the Disputed Questions Podcast, Episode 2, which is really the third overall episode since we started with the intro at 0. In the previous episode, I introduced and gave background context for the work known as Aristotle's Categories, noting many of the difficulties and disputes which have been historically associated with the text. In this episode, though, we're going to actually begin reading it for ourselves. To start, let's take a look at the structure and outline of the work. The Categories is a relatively short treatise, all things considered. In my Complete Works of Aristotle copy, it comes out to about 22 pages total. It is somewhat humorous, then, that such a small work has generated such a large amount of literature over the centuries. Paul Studman quips that, quote, "One would be hard-pressed to find in the Western philosophical tradition a greater combination of brevity and provocative metaphysical speculation," end quote. Indeed, its brevity is often exactly what exasperates its obscurity and difficulty, as we shall see. The text of the Categories is divided into 15 chapters. It is also typically separated into parts. Traditionally, this division was into 3 parts, labeled the pre-predicamenta, or anti-predicamenta, the predicamenta, and the post-predicamenta. The pre-predicamenta consists of chapters 1 to 4, the predicamenta, chapters 5 to 9, and the post-predicamenta, chapters 10 to 15. There has historically been much debate on how exactly these parts fit together, and even if they fit together, especially concerning the relationship of the post-predicamenta to the rest of the text. This goes back to what we discussed in the previous episode when we talked about how many scholars think that the Categories may not have been originally written by Aristotle as a single work, but may consist of parts or sections or fragments of different works from Aristotle, which a later editor compiled and combined under a single title. As Paul Studman says, quote, "There is considerable debate about whether Aristotle thought all 3 parts belonged to a single work, and if he did, why he thought they all needed for the work why they are all needed for the work to be a unified whole," end quote. Again, it's not part of our intention here to try to provide solutions to some of these disputes, but what we will do is simply explain what the actual text itself says, and then perhaps give some of the historical interpretations along with pointing out some of the difficulties. It is somewhat evident from the titles of the 3 parts that the heart of the whole work is the middle section, the predicamenta. The other 2 parts are both named in relation to this one, which is also the part of greatest length. For instance, in my copy, the 4 chapters of the pre-predicamenta take up a page and a half, the 6 chapters of the post-predicamenta take up about 7 pages, and the 5 chapters of the predicamenta take up about 14 pages. Predicamenta in Latin referred to categories, and specifically Aristotle's famous 10 categories, which are presented in the middle section. Indeed, both the middle section and the work as a whole get their medieval Latin titles from the 10 categories, as both were called the predicamenta. This fact clearly shows the centrality of the middle section to the work as a whole, at least as it was traditionally interpreted. In terms of content, the following summary is given by Studman. Quote, "In the pre-predicamenta, Aristotle discusses a number of semantic relations, gives a division of beings into 4 kinds, and then presents his canonical list of 10 categories. In the Predicamenta, Aristotle discusses in detail the categories of substance, quantity, relatives, and quality, and provides a cursory treatment of the other categories. And finally, in the Post-Predicamenta, he discusses a number of concepts relating to modes of opposition, priority and simultaneity, motion, and ends with a brief discussion of having." End quote. All right, so at this point, I think the best thing to do is to simply jump into the text. The Pre-Predicamenta, as I said, consists of chapters 1 to 4. Chapter 1 gives and defines 3 terms: homonymous, synonymous, and paronymus, which are all really fun to pronounce together. These are also called equivocal, univocal, and derivative or denominative. Again, very fun to pronounce. I will now read from the very beginning of the first chapter. The translation I'm reading from here is the E.M. Edkill translation, or E.M. Edkill, not sure exactly how to pronounce the name. This translation is in the public domain. So yeah, let's begin. Quote, "Things are said to be named equivocally when, though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. Thus, a real man and a figure and a picture can both lay claim to the name animal. Yet these are equivocally so named, for, though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. For, should anyone define in what sense each is an animal, his definition in the one case will be appropriate to that case only." End quote. As you can see, Aristotle here gives no introduction or prefatory remarks. He simply jumps straight into the content. The subject of this first paragraph is things which are said to be named equivocally, or, as J.L. Ackrell translates it, things called homonymous. The actual Greek word used by Aristotle is homonyma, which is where we get our English words such as homonym, homonymy, etc. The Latin translation, however, uses the word equivoca, which is, as might be guessed, where we get our word equivocal. I'll probably go back and forth in using both terms throughout this episode, so just be prepared for that. But what does it mean for something to be called equivocal or homonymous? As the text says, quote, "Things are said to be named equivocally when, though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each." End quote. We have 3 elements here: things, names, and definitions. Things which have a common name but different definitions corresponding with that common name are homonymous things. So the things are different, their definitions are different, but they share the same name. They are united in name. Definition here, which is actually translated from the Greek word logos, refers to what the thing is, to its essence. So to say that 2 things have the same name but differ in definition means they are actually different in essence or being. The example Aristotle gives in the text is that of a real man and a figure and a picture. According to Ackrell, quote, "The word translated animal originally meant just that, but it had come to be used also of pictures or other artistic representations, whether representations of animals or not." End quote. If this is correct, then any painting could be called by the name animal, and any actually living animal would, of course, be called by the same name. But obviously, living animals and paintings, whether or not they are called by the same name, are different things, and different kinds of things. They are distinct not only numerically, but also specifically, i.e. in species and also in genus, referring to the logical sense of genus and species rather than the biological, which we'll be discussing probably in the next episode. So, as Aristotle says, although, quote, "a real man and a figure and a picture can both lay claim to the name animal, yet these are equivocally so named. For though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. For, should anyone define in what sense each is an animal, his definition in the one case will be appropriate to that case only." End quote. I like the way Ackrell puts this last part in his translation. Quote, "If one is to say what being an animal is for each of them, one will give two distinct definitions." End quote. In other words, if I take these two things which have the same name, and for each of them ask the question of what it is, I will get two different answers. Now, standard medieval commentators gave a slightly different interpretation for the example in the text. They seem to have been unaware, as E. Jennifer Ashworth writes, quote, that the Greek word used by Aristotle was genuinely polysemous, meaning both animal and image, and they explained the extended use of animal in terms of a likeness between the two referents. End quote. In other words, they took it that the example just refers to an image of an actual animal and not any image whatsoever. For instance, I might refer to that man in the painting or that cat in the painting. If I have a painting of a man, even though in reality what it is, if I have a painting of a man, I will obviously refer to the figure in the painting as a man, since it is a representation of a man, even though in reality what it is just paint on a canvas. Both a real man and a man in a painting are called by the name human, but it is very different to be a real man as opposed to being only a painting of a man. I would much rather be a real person than a painting of a person. So from what we know of the Greek, the first interpretation I gave seems to me more likely to be the intended meaning of the text. However, the medieval interpretation is still philosophically interesting and important, especially when we start talking about analogy, which we shall do shortly. Anyways, the first interpretation I gave, which I think is probably correct, means that the example depends upon Greek language usage, but we can think of examples for English. One might be perhaps a bank, as in a river bank on the one hand, or in a bank where you keep money on the other hand. Another might be bat, as in baseball bat, or the flying nocturnal mammal bat. The latter especially is a case of what was traditionally called pure or absolute equivocals, which is when two very different things just happen to have the same name entirely by chance. To use an example from St. Thomas Aquinas, pure equivocals are analogous to a situation where two different people just happen to have the same name, like if you meet two different people named Robert. Other works of Aristotle indicate that he thinks there are different kinds of homonyms besides pure equivocals. For pure equivocals, the only thing in common is the name, but other kinds of homonyms have other relations to each other. So, in the Physics, Aristotle writes, quote, "Some homonymies are far removed from one another. Some have a certain likeness, and some are nearly related either generically or analogically, with the result that they seem not to be homonymies, though they really are." End quote. Here we find the roots for the important distinction between equivocity and analogy that later thinkers, especially from Boethius through the scholastics of the medieval era, would make much use of in their philosophical and theological systems. We'll touch more on this distinction below. For now, let's continue with the text of the first chapter. Quote, "On the other hand, things are said to be named univocally, which have both the name and the definition answering to the name in common. A man and an ox are both animal, and these are univocally so named, inasmuch as not only the name, but also the definition, is the same in both cases. For if a man should state in what sense each is an animal, the statement in the one case would be identical with that in the other." End quote. Here we have, instead of things named equivocally, things named univocally. Other translations, such as Acryl's, use the term synonymous. The situation here is similar to the one above. The Greek word used by Aristotle is synonyma. The word used in Latin translations was univoca. From the former we get synonymous, from the latter univocal. It's important to note, though, that what Aristotle means here by synonymous things is different from what we refer to in modern English as synonyms. In English, synonyms are different words which have the same or which have equivalent or similar meanings, such as the words rage and fury. For Aristotle, synonymous things are things which have the same name and the same definition or meaning. They are called the same thing, and they are the same in reality, the same in essence or kind. The example Aristotle gives is of a man and an ox. Both a man and an ox are called animals, and this name animal has the same definition in both cases. It means the same thing for both. A classical definition of animal was a living substance capable of sensation, and this definition fits both a man and an ox. Another example might be a red shirt and a red wall. They are two different things, but they are both called red, and red has the same meaning for both. Again, as with equivocals, we have three distinct elements: things or reference, names, and definitions. For both equivocals and univocals, the referents are distinct and the name is the same. But for equivocals, the definitions are different for each referent, while for univocals, the definition is the same for each referent. A couple of points to mention here. First, homonymy and synonymy for Aristotle apparently refer primarily to things, not words, at least here in the categories. This is what Acryl says in his commentary. Quote, "The terms homonymous and synonymous, as defined by Aristotle in this chapter, apply not to words but to things. Roughly, two things are homonymous if the same name applies to both but not in the same sense. Synonymous if the same name applies to both in the same sense. It is important to recognize from the start that the categories is not primarily or explicitly about names, but about the things that names signify." End quote. Now, Acryl is here taking a stance on a very ancient, very controversial debate over precisely this question of whether the categories is first about things or words or concepts. We talked a little about this debate in the previous episode. Putting aside the larger question of what the categories as a whole is about, it does look to me like in this section, when Aristotle is discussing homonyms and synonyms, kind of tongue twisters, when Aristotle is discussing them, the referents are things, concrete, singular things. This is different from English, where homonyms and synonyms are primarily words. So, in English, again, two words are synonyms if they have the same meaning. But that wouldn't really work for Aristotle's case. In English, for two words to be synonyms, they have to be two different words with the same meaning. But for Aristotle, synonyms have the same name, so there's only one word involved. But that same name is applied to distinct things, and hence it is the things which are synonymous because they share a common name with a single meaning. One implication of synonymy and homonymy referring to things is that, as Acryl notes, quote, "Two things may be both homonymous and synonymous. If there is one name that applies to both, but not in the same sense, and another name that applies to both in the same sense." End quote. For instance, if I have a black baseball bat and a black flying mammal bat, insofar as they are both called bat, they are homonymous. But insofar as they are both called black, they are synonymous, since the name black has the same meaning in both cases. Further, the same thing could potentially be homonymous with some things and synonymous with other things. For example, a wooden baseball bat is homonymous with a flying mammal bat, but synonymous with a wooden bench, insofar as both are wooden. So that's homonymy and synonymy. There's still one more term that Aristotle introduces in the first chapter, and that's paronymy, or derivative or denominative things. So, to quote the text, quote, "Things are said to be named derivatively, which derive their name from some other name, but differ from it in termination. Thus, the grammarian derives his name from the word grammar, and the courageous man from the word courage." End quote. I'd also like to read here the first line of the same text from the Acral translation. Quote, "When things get their name from something with a difference of ending, they are called paronymous." End quote. Right up front, we should realize that homonymy and synonymy have a relationship with each other which paronymy does not have. As Acral puts it, quote, "Paronymous is obviously not a term coordinate with homonymous and synonymous." End quote. Homonymy and synonymy are direct opposites. One is two things sharing a common name but with different meanings. The other is two things sharing a common name but with the same meanings. In both cases, there is a common name applied to distinct things. This is not so with paronymous things. Allow me to read once more from Acral's commentary. Quote, "A thing is paronymous if its name is in a certain way derivative. The derivativeness in question is not etymological." So many big words in this episode. Aristotle is not claiming that the word brave was invented after the word bravery. He is claiming, rather, that brave means having bravery. The brave is so called because of, or from, the bravery he has. For an X to be paronymous requires both that an X is called X because of something, some feature, property, etc., which it has, or which somehow belongs to it, and that X is identical with the name of that something except in ending. End quote. So a paronymous thing, in short, is something which is called a certain name because of some feature it has, and that name which it is called on account of that feature is derived from or named in relation to the name of that feature itself. This is a bit more complicated than homonymy and synonymy, and it's not immediately clear what relationship exactly it has to them. But to try to make some more sense of it, let's consider more closely one of Aristotle's examples, brave and bravery. The brave man is paronymous qua brave. He is paronymous because he is called brave, and he is called brave because of a certain feature he has, the feature of being brave. The feature of being brave itself is called bravery. And so the brave man is called brave from his bravery. His being called brave is derived from his having bravery. It is because he has bravery that he is called brave. And the terms brave and bravery are the same except in ending, as Aristotle says, as are the terms grammar and grammarian, generous and generosity, courage and courageous, etc. For Aristotle, something only counts as paronymous if its name is the same with that from which it is named, except in ending. It's important to realize that paronymy is not equivalent to what later scholastic thinkers would call analogy. When I first read the categories, I think I just assumed that paronymy must be equivalent to analogy, because when scholastic writers talk about equivocity and univocity, they also typically talk about analogy. But paronymy is very different from analogy. In fact, analogy really might be said to fall under the heading of homonymy, although not pure homonymy or equivocity. Pure equivocity, again, is the direct opposite of univocity, but analogy falls somewhere in between the two. Things are analogous, very basically, if they have a common name and different definitions, but their definitions are related in some way. Because the definitions really differ, this cannot be univocity. But because the definitions are not absolutely unrelated or separate, it's not pure equivocity either. A more explicit and systematic understanding of analogy as distinct from univocity and equivocity is a development of later philosophers, especially medieval philosophers. But the roots of it are already really present throughout Aristotle's works, although he does not mention it explicitly in this present catalog in the first chapter of the Categories. If analogy had to be classified under any of the three options given in this first chapter, it would be equivocity. It would come closest to that. Okay, so that's all of chapter 1 as far as text goes. So let's consider now two questions. First, why is the distinction between homonymy, synonymy, and paronymy that Aristotle introduces here important? Why does it matter? And second, why does Aristotle begin the Categories with this distinction? There are a number of different answers that we could offer for the first question. For one thing, the distinction is important for logic, reasoning, and argumentation in general. You may have heard before of what's called the Fallacy of Equivocation. A fallacy, very simplistically, is an error in reasoning. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines equivocation as, quote, an argument which exploits the ambiguity of a term or phrase which has occurred at least twice in an argument, such that on the first occurrence it has one meaning and on the second another meaning, end quote. I like this example from the Texas State Philosophy Department website. Quote, noisy children are a real headache. 2 aspirin will make a headache go away. Therefore, 2 aspirin will make noisy children go away, end quote. The conclusion does not follow from the premises because the term headache is used in 2 very different senses in the 2 premises. In one premise, the term is used in a literal sense, in the other, a figurative sense. Because of this, the argument is defective and fails to justify its conclusion. I'll give one more example of the fallacy of equivocation that I think is funny from an older logic textbook by Edward D. Simmons. He writes, quote, the importance of identity and signification for logical discourse can be seen if we note the differences in the following attempts at argument. 1. Every triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, but every isosceles triangle is a triangle. Therefore, every isosceles triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles. 2. Every triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, but John's romantic situation is a triangle. Therefore, John's romantic situation has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, end quote. Poor John, I'm not sure how he's going to figure that situation out. Obviously, these examples are silly and trivial, but they nevertheless point out the implications of equivocation for logic and argumentation and rational discourse. As Simmons writes later in the book, quote, logical discourse requires a rigorous determination of the meanings of the terms involved and a uniformity in the use of these terms in the propositions of the discourse. Otherwise, the argument will lack integrity, for it leaves in doubt the status of the terms, which are the fundamental elements into which any discourse can be finally resolved, end quote. Understanding the distinction between equivocity and univocity can also help us think about the relationships between language, thought, and reality. Reason aims at truth about reality, but reason is a process of thought. And, for the most part, we reason and argue with words, either vocal or written. So if we don't properly grasp the relationships between these things, we are liable to making crucial mistakes which keep us from truth and knowledge. A second reason why it's important to understand this distinction is that it is very fruitful and useful in helping to solve philosophical and theological problems. Aristotle uses the distinction, for instance, throughout his works, and future thinkers develop it even further, as we've already mentioned. To mention one important example from Aristotle, He uses the distinction in the Nicomachean Ethics to argue against Plato's theory of the form of good. Basically, Plato posited one form of good which exists over and above and apart from all individual instances of good. But Aristotle criticizes this essentially on the basis that good is not univocal. It does not have a single definition or meaning, but is used in different senses. Because of this, he says, quote, "There could not be a common idea or form set over all these goods," and, quote, "The good, therefore, is not something common answering to one idea," end quote. To mention another example from later usage, St. Thomas Aquinas will famously argue that the same names cannot be given to both God and creatures univocally, nor equivocally, but analogically. The distinction is also significant if we think back to Socrates and aspects of his philosophical method. Socrates is famously portrayed as going around asking people questions such as, "What is virtue?" or "What is justice?" These are, of course, crucial questions, the purpose of which is to come to knowledge and truth about profound and fundamental matters. But if we don't recognize, for instance, that virtue and justice might have different meanings, then our questions about them are bound to lead to confusion or error rather than clarity and truth. The distinction between equivocity and univocity, and also analogy, allows for greater nuance and carefulness in pursuing knowledge. The same is also true for paronymy. Aristotle will even make use of his understanding of paronymy later on in the categories. As Ackrell points out, paronymy serves an important function in predication. Predication is the attribution of something to a subject. For instance, in the statement, "The wall is green," I attribute or predicate green to a subject, namely the wall. But when I say the wall is green, I obviously don't intend to signify that the wall and the color green are the same thing. This is explained well by Ackrell. Quote, "In white is a color, white names a quality. In Callias is white, white indicates the inherence of the quality in Callias. Here we get homonymy or something like it, since the definition of white in the former sentence cannot be substituted for white in the latter. Callias is not a color of a certain kind." End quote. In other words, in saying something like "the wall is green," we don't mean to say that the wall is identical to the color green. Rather, we mean to say that green is a quality which the wall has. Paronymy can help prevent confusion in such cases of predication. For example, and I'm drawing here again from what Ackrell explains in his commentary and the examples he uses, bravery is a certain quality which some people have. When we are treating of this quality in itself, in the abstract, we just call it bravery. For instance, we might say bravery is a virtue. But when we predicate bravery of a subject, we do not say she is bravery, but she is brave. And this is paronymy. Brave is paronymous. Because it is so, one is much less likely in making the mistake in thinking that when we say she is brave, what we mean is that she is identical with the virtue bravery. She is not bravery, she is brave, which just means that she has bravery as a quality. Both refer to the same quality, but they refer to it in different ways. As Ackrell says, using the example of generosity, quote, "Generosity and generous introduce the very same thing, generosity, though in different ways. Generosity simply naming it, and generous serving to predicate it," end quote. And as Aristotle puts it later on in the categories, quote, "These then that we have mentioned are qualities, while things called paronymously because of these, or called in some other way from them, are qualified." End quote. Another way to put it is that bravery is a noun naming a virtue, while brave is an adjective ascribing that virtue to something, to a subject. Paronymous terms thus help denote the precise function of a word, especially in predication. And this plays an important role in the categories, which brings us to our second question. Why does Aristotle begin the categories by introducing equivocity, univocity, and paronymy? I don't really have a definite answer to this question, but there are a couple of points that can be made. If the categories really is a logical work and the introductory work to the whole of logic, as the traditional position maintained, then it is certainly not inappropriate to begin with a discussion of notions as important to logic as these, and we've already discussed why they're important to logic. Furthermore, one possible interpretation of the categories is that it is a work very much about predication, and that the 10 categories themselves are types of predicate or types of predication. And the notions of equivocity, univocity, and paronymy are absolutely crucial to a proper understanding of predication. As we mentioned earlier, the first part of the categories was traditionally called the antipredicamenta, another big word, which literally means before the categories. The antipredicamenta was thus thought to introduce various points necessary to be understood prior to considering the 10 categories themselves. And this distinction between equivocity, univocity, and paronymy was called the first antipredicament. Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this episode here. Obviously, we did not get very far into the text. In fact, we only completed the first chapter. I did not intend to go as slowly as I am through the text, but honestly, there's just so much to unpack with this text, and I'm already leaving out so much as it is. But I hope that you find the information discussed here interesting and helpful, and that it hasn't been too much or too dense. My plan as of now is to at least finish the rest of the first part, the antipredicamenta, in the next episode, and then maybe finish the rest of the text in 1 or 2 episodes after that. Again, that's way more episodes on the categories than I had originally intended, but hopefully people won't lose interest before we can move on to other texts. Before I finish, I thought I'd give some of the main sources I used in researching this episode in case people are interested in reading further for themselves. Probably the main source was J.L. Ackrell's notes on the categories from the Clarendon Aristotle series book Aristotle's Categories and De Interpretatione, translated with notes and glossary by J.L. Ackrell. Ackrell's is one of the standard translations of the categories, and his notes are very helpful. Another useful source was a paper in the journal The Thomist by M.D. Philip, or Philippe, I think pronunciation. The title of the paper is Analogon and Analogia in the Philosophy of Aristotle. Another paper to mention is Homonymy in Aristotle by T.H. Irwin in the Review of Metaphysics. If you want to read the Edgehill translation of the categories that I read from throughout this episode, it's in the public domain and it can be accessed for free online at the Internet Classics Archive. So that is all for this episode. If you've enjoyed, please subscribe, rate, and review, and share with your friends. As of this past week, I'm officially finished with my undergraduate studies, so I hope that over the summer, I hope to be able to get episodes out more frequently and more consistently. I tentatively plan on having the next episode out by a week from when this episode is released, so stay tuned for that. If you have any comments, critiques, questions, or recommendations, please feel free to send them my way. You can either leave them as a comment on the YouTube video for this episode, or else you can email them to me at disputedquestionsblog@gmail.com. I'd really enjoy hearing from you and learning about what you think of the podcast so far. And with that, thank you again for listening, and may God grant you peace, safety, and an unquenchable love of truth.